Luca Renshaw pounded on the rooftop door of the Sterling Grand Hotel with the side of his fist, teeth clenched as the echo of his knocking disappeared into the night sky. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, rattling the handle again. Locked, the heavy steel door didn't budge. He pulled out his phone only to find a black screen. Dead, of course. He turned around, facing the edge of the rooftop. Manhattan glittered in every direction, the wind tugging at his open suit jacket. Below him, the city pulsed with noise and movement. Up here, it was silent, too silent. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had come up here for 5 minutes of air after a suffocating board dinner, 5 minutes to breathe, 5 minutes to think. And now he was locked out of a 7-star hotel, on the roof. He leaned back against the metal door, muttering a string of curses before letting his head thump lightly against it. "I own half of this damn hotel," he said to no one. "And I'm the one stuck up here like an idiot." That's when he heard the creak of the emergency exit door on the opposite side of the rooftop. He straightened, turning sharply. A woman stepped out, her arms wrapped around a book and a cup of something that looked like coffee. She froze when she saw him. Luca frowned. "You work here?" She raised a brow. "Do I look like I work here, actually?" She didn't. She wore jeans, a loose gray sweatshirt, and red Converse sneakers. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a messy bun on top of her head, and her face was bare, no makeup, no filter, just real. "I'm locked out," he said, stepping toward her. "The door shut behind me." You wouldn't happen to have. She was already walking toward the door she'd come through, balancing her cup between her arm and chest as she dug in her pocket. He blinked. "Wait, you have a key?" "I do," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm staying on the 26th floor. I found this rooftop a few days ago, quietest place in the city. I come up to read." She pushed the door open and held it, her eyes meeting his. "You coming or?" Something about her voice, dry, amused, made him pause, but it was her smile that caught him completely off guard. It was quick, a flash really, but bright, warm, unfiltered. He stepped through the door without thinking. "Thanks," he said, brushing past her. They started down the stairs together, the hum of the city growing quieter with each step. He glanced at her again. She wasn't even looking at him. Just sipping her coffee and flipping open her book. "You always rescue strange men off rooftops?" he asked. She shrugged. "Only ones who look like they're about to throw themselves off the edge," he grinned. "That obvious, huh, hum?" They walked a few more flights in silence before he cleared his throat. "I'm Luca." She looked up. "Luca," he hesitated. Most people recognized his name, or at least his last name. "Renshaw," she blinked. "Like the Renshaw Group, so you have heard of it." She let out a short laugh. "Heard of it? My old boss used to say if you wanted something done in Manhattan, you either called the city or Luca Renshaw." He tilted his head. "You knew who I was this whole time?" "Not until just now." She gave him a sideways glance. "You clean up pretty well, but I wouldn't have guessed billionaire CEO." "Millionaire," he corrected. "Billionaire was last year." She laughed again. It was quick, low, but it did something to his chest. He hadn't heard someone laugh like that, unaffected, honest, in a long time. "I'm Poppy," she said, holding out her hand as they reached the 26th floor. He took it. Her hand was warm. "Poppy what?" "Sanders." They stood there for a second too long, her hand still in his. He gave a small shake of his head, forcing himself to let go. "Well, thank you, Miss Sanders. You might have saved me from hypothermia, or worse, public embarrassment." She smiled again, and it was worse this time, or better, depending on how you looked at it. "You've got a whole city under you, Mr. Renshaw, but you still managed to get stuck. Ironic, right?" She paused, then pushed open the door to the hallway. "Good night, Luca." He watched her leave, her sneakers squeaking slightly against the polished floor. He didn't move until she was gone. The next morning, he couldn't focus. His assistant, Grace, was rattling off numbers from the quarterly report, but his mind kept drifting back to the rooftop. And the girl with the book, Poppy. He'd been with models, actresses, women who wore diamonds like skin, but none of them had ever made him feel something by just smiling. He pushed back from the table. "Cancel my 11, he said. Grace blinked. "Sir, I'm heading out. I'll sign the reports later." He didn't know what he was doing exactly, just that he found himself in the hotel lobby an hour later, asking the front desk about a woman on the 26th floor. Miss Sanders checked out this morning, the concierge said politely. Left around 8, Luca stared. Did she leave a forwarding address or no, sir? He turned away, annoyed with himself for even thinking she'd make it easy. Of course she wouldn't. That night he went back to the rooftop. It was quiet again, wind rustling through the plants they'd installed for ambience. He walked to the same spot he'd stood in the night before, and there it was, a book, curled slightly at the edges from use, a sticky note on the front in neat handwriting. Next time, bring your own key. P.S., Luca smiled, Poppy Sanders. She had no idea what she'd started. Luca stood at the edge of the rooftop, the book still in his hand. The note was folded neatly inside it now, tucked between pages as if she'd marked a moment she wanted him to find. His fingers brushed over the worn spine. He didn't recognize the title. It wasn't some bestseller. It was obscure, literary, probably something she'd found in a dusty corner of a used bookstore and fallen in love with. He had no idea why the book mattered so much, or why he couldn't stop thinking about her. He left the rooftop and headed down to the street, not knowing where he was going until he was already in one of his cars. He told the driver to take him to the Lower East Side. It was a guess, a shot in the dark really, but something about her sweatshirt, her sneakers, the way she'd talked, it didn't scream Upper East Side. The city blurred past the windows. He leaned back, still gripping the book like it might offer a clue if he just held it long enough. When the car pulled up to a worn red brick building with a bookstore on the corner, something about it made him pause. Wait here. He stepped out and crossed the sidewalk, pushing open the glass door. A tiny bell chimed overhead. The place smelled like paper and dust, and the aisles were narrow, crowded with books that stretched up to the ceiling. "Can I help you?" a woman behind the counter asked, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. "I'm looking for someone," Luca said, holding up the book. "She left this on a hotel rooftop. I think she might have gotten it here." The woman looked at the cover, her mouth tilted slightly. "Poppy Sanders," his pulse kicked up. "You know her. She comes in every week, leaves notes in the books she likes. Says it's her version of matchmaking for lonely readers." He stared at the woman. "Matchmaking? She believes books find people at the right time," the woman said, then pointed toward the back. "If she's not working, she's usually at the cafe on Hutton Street, couple blocks that way. Look for the place with the crooked sign." The cafe was small, tucked between a tailor's shop and a record store, with a painted wooden sign that leaned to the left, just like the woman had said. Luca stood across the street, watching through the window, and there she was. Poppy sat alone at a table near the window, a half-eaten pastry on her plate and an open notebook in front of her. She wasn't reading this time, she was writing. Her brow was furrowed, a pen between her fingers, her lips mouthing silent words. He didn't go in right away. Instead, he watched her laugh at something the barista said as he passed. It wasn't the same laugh from the rooftop. This one was lighter, more casual. He realized she probably had dozens of versions of her laugh, and he wanted to hear every single one. When he finally stepped inside, the bell above the door rang out softly. She didn't look up right away. Only when he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without asking did her gaze lift. Her eyes widened slightly. "You found the book. You left it for me. I figured you'd come back," she said, closing her notebook, "but I didn't expect an actual search party." "I asked 3 different strangers in 2 different neighborhoods," he said. "One of them tried to sell me a harmonica." She tilted her head. "You tracked me down. Why?" He leaned forward slightly. "Because I don't like loose ends." "Is that what I am?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes were curious. "A loose end? No," he said. "You're a question I don't know the answer to yet." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a sip from her mug, then set it down carefully. "Most people would have just let it go." "I'm not most people," she smiled faintly. "I figured that out when you told me you owned half the hotel." He studied her. "What were you writing?" "Thoughts," she said. "Ideas, scenes." "I write plays, off-Broadway stuff, mostly for myself." "You write plays and leave notes in books for strangers. Everyone has their version of chaos." He nodded slowly. "Mine involves mergers, acquisitions, and a boardroom full of men who think I shouldn't be the one in charge." She tapped her pen against the table. "And yet you are." He didn't answer that. Instead, he glanced around the cafe. You come here a lot. It's loud enough to drown out the voices in my head, but quiet enough to think. Balance is rare. He let his gaze settle on her again. You're not what I expected. Good. I didn't say it was a bad thing. I didn't ask. He laughed under his breath. You're difficult. Only to people who think I'm supposed to be easy. The way she said it made his chest tighten. She wasn't trying to be clever. She just was. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, black velvet box. He set it on the table without opening it. She stared at it. What is that? A thank you, for unlocking a door, for making me notice something I hadn't in a long time. She hesitated, then slowly opened the box. Inside was a bracelet, platinum, simple, with a single sapphire embedded in the center. I can't accept this, she said instantly, pushing it toward him. You didn't even ask what it meant. I don't need to. It's too much. It's not about the cost. It is when you're a billionaire and I write plays in a notebook that no one reads. He leaned forward. I didn't give it to you because I thought you needed it. Then why? Because you're the kind of woman who leaves stories behind for strangers, and I wanted to remind you that someone noticed. She looked down at the bracelet again, then slowly closed the box. I'll take it, she said, if you promise not to show up with a matching tiara next time. I'll try to restrain myself. She smiled again, and this time he didn't want to look away. You have somewhere to be? She asked, surprising him. I cleared my schedule. Just like that. I own the company, I can do that. She reached for her coat. Then come with me. He stood as she did, following her out into the cold. Neither of them said anything as they walked, but something had shifted. She didn't ask him where they were going. And he didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't leading. He was just following a girl with a story written on her skin and a spark in her eyes, and it felt like the beginning of something he didn't want to escape. The wind off the East River cut sharp between the buildings as they turned down a narrow street in Chinatown, the sidewalk slick with rain from earlier that morning. Poppy moved ahead without looking back, her steps confident, while Luca followed, the heel of his Italian leather shoes clicking against cracked pavement. She hadn't told him where they were going, and he hadn't asked. There was something strangely grounding about being the one without the answers for once. They stopped outside a tall, faded building with peeling white paint and a rusted fire escape zigzagging up the side. A metal gate guarded the front entrance, and Poppy leaned into the buzzer panel, pressing a worn button labeled Studio 4C. After a moment, a buzz sounded, and she pulled the gate open. You live here? Luca asked, glancing up at the crooked windows. I work here, she said, leading him inside. My apartment's across town, but this is where the magic happens. Inside, the hallway smelled of sawdust and old paint. They passed a row of closed doors before she pushed one open. The space beyond was wide and open, the walls covered in pinned-up sketches, pages of handwritten dialogue, and glowing string lights that looped overhead like stars on a stage. A half-constructed set stood in one corner, the outline of a city street built from painted plywood and imagination. This is where you write? Luca asked, stepping inside. And build, she said, pulling off her coat and tossing it onto a battered armchair. Rehearsals happen here when we're not renting out a black box theater. Most of the time, it's just me and a drill gun. He turned slowly, taking it all in. It's like walking into your head. Terrifying, isn't it? She grinned, then crossed the room to a long table cluttered with props and costume scraps. Help me move this. He stepped over, grabbing one end of the table as she lifted the other. They shifted it against the wall, clearing space in the center of the floor. You ever acted? She asked, brushing a curl from her face as she looked up at him. Never, he replied, unless corporate spin counts. Tonight's your debut, she said, reaching for a pair of pages from a stack nearby. I need to hear how this scene flows out loud. You'll read opposite me. Luca raised an eyebrow. What am I playing? A man who doesn't know what he wants until it's standing in front of him. He took the page. Typecasting. She laughed under her breath. Don't flatter yourself. They ran the scene twice, then again, her voice shifting with each reading. Luca found himself forgetting the lines and watching her instead, how her expression changed, how she paced when searching for the right inflection, how her fingers twirled the edge of the page when she was unsure. When they stopped, she dropped onto the floor, crossing her legs beneath her. "That was better," she said, leaning back on her palms. "Still needs work." Luca sat beside her, his tie loosened now, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked over at her, breath still uneven from the last run through. "You're different when you're in here," he said. "So are you," he turned to face her. "How, you're not performing, you're just present." He studied her a moment, then looked away. "I don't really know how to do anything without trying to win. That's exhausting. I wouldn't know any other way." She didn't offer sympathy. Instead, she leaned forward and plucked a pencil from behind her ear, scribbling something in the margin of one of the pages. "I used to think ambition was about reaching," she said finally, "but sometimes it's about staying. Choosing something and not running." Her voice was quiet, but it landed deep. "I've never stayed for anything I couldn't control," he admitted. And now, he didn't answer. She stood, brushing off her jeans, and disappeared behind a curtain. A minute later, she returned with 2 tall mugs. Steam curled from the tops. "Chamomile with honey," she said, handing him one. "Don't argue, you look like your brain is sprinting in circles." He took the mug, the heat sinking into his palms. "I don't usually get handed tea in warehouses. Then you're spending time in the wrong warehouses." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards and the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Rain began again outside, tapping against the high windows. "I looked you up last night," she said suddenly. "After you left." He turned his head slowly. "And you're not what I thought." Disappointed, she shook her head. "Just surprised. You give away scholarships anonymously. You fund a pediatric wing uptown, but you've never let your name be added to the wall. You've invested in over 20 startups in the last 2 years, and half of them are run by women." He stared into his tea. "I don't advertise kindness." "It's not a strategy." "I didn't say it was." She reached for her notebook and opened it to a blank page. "I don't write love stories," she said. "Not because I don't believe in them, but because most of the time people mistake chaos for love. And what are we?" She tilted her head. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." He leaned toward her, slow, deliberate. "Maybe it's not chaos, maybe it's clarity." She held his gaze, but didn't move away. The distance between them wasn't wide, but it felt like the edge of something steep. Then, without a word, she stood and walked to the opposite wall, where dozens of sticky notes were pinned in a rough timeline. She pulled one down and brought it back to him. On it, in her handwriting, were 5 words. "Let it be something real." He looked at it, then back at her. "It already is," he said. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened just for a second. "Then don't ruin it," she said. And somehow, in the quiet of that moment, surrounded by unfinished scripts and the scent of rain, Luca Renshaw felt something he hadn't in years: stillness, real, unforced. Undeniable and terrifyingly beautiful, the gala was a calculated risk. Luca had never brought a date to a Renshaw Foundation event, not in the 15 years since he'd taken over, not even when the press had begged for headlines. But tonight, as he stood near the marble staircase of the historic Astoria Hall, he wasn't thinking about media optics or strategic alliances. He was thinking about Poppy. The room glowed in candlelight and crystal. Waiters in crisp black and white moved like clockwork, refilling champagne flutes and offering trays of imported hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played near the fountain, their music barely audible over the hum of conversation and clinking glasses. Luca's eyes scanned the entrance again. "Still waiting?" Grace asked, appearing at his side in a navy gown as structured as her schedule. "She's coming," he said. Grace gave him a look. "You've never been this nervous, not even when we closed the Barrow acquisition." "I wasn't in love with Barrow," she blinked. "You just said the word." "I know." He adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket, the engraved cufflink catching the light. It was his father's, he hadn't worn it since the funeral. A hush fell over the crowd as the doors opened again, and then there she was. Poppy stepped through the entrance wearing a midnight blue dress that fell like ink over her frame. Her hair was swept back, pinned with a delicate silver clip shaped like a quill. There was nothing flashy about her entrance, no dramatic pause or practiced smile, but the room shifted. Luca moved toward her before he realized his feet were doing it. "You didn't tell me this would look like a royal coronation," she said as he reached her. You didn't tell me you'd look like that. I borrowed the dress from a costume rack and made it look like couture. She glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Do they know I'm not one of them? They know I brought someone worth knowing. Her eyes met his. Are you sure about this? I've never been more sure. He extended his arm. She took it. They moved through the crowd together, and for once, Luca didn't feel like he had to command the room. With her beside him, it felt like the room belonged to them both. They paused beside the stage, where a massive LED screen displayed the night's purpose, raising funds to rebuild community theaters across the city. A cause Poppy had mentioned once in passing. He'd remembered when he stepped onto the platform, the room quieted. He didn't glance at the teleprompter. Tonight's about stories, he began. Not just the ones we watch, but the ones we live, the ones we choose, and the ones we never see coming. He looked out over the crowd, then down at Poppy, who stood just beyond the edge of the stage. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but her expression was unreadable. I used to think power was the ability to change the world, but I've learned that real power is letting someone change you. There was a pause, a shift. I met someone recently who reminded me that there's more to life than control. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That love isn't about owning, it's about showing up, again and again. He stepped down from the stage, the applause rising behind him, but he didn't hear it. He walked straight to her. Poppy Sanders, he said, stopping in front of her. You've rewritten every page I thought I'd already lived. She shook her head slightly, her voice low. Luca, I know this is fast. I know it doesn't fit into any narrative you've written. But you're the only thing that's ever felt like it makes sense. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a ring, but for something else, the sticky note. He'd kept it. Let it be something real. He offered it to her. I'm all in. No pretense, no conditions, just us. If you want it. She looked at the note, then at him. And if I say yes, then I'll spend the rest of my life proving it wasn't a mistake. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the space between them, then stopped talking and kissed me. He did. It wasn't careful, it wasn't rehearsed. It was raw and electric and real, the kind of kiss that pauses time. That rewrites chapters. Around them, the gala continued, but for Luca, nothing else existed. Later that night, they sat barefoot on the rooftop of the Sterling Grand, her heels dangling from one hand, his tie undone. I used to come up here to escape, he said, his voice quiet against the hum of Manhattan below. And now I come to remember the moment everything changed. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I used to think love was too fragile for real life, she said, but maybe it's the only thing that holds. He laced his fingers through hers. I got locked out of a hotel, he said, and found the only door that ever really mattered. They stayed there, watching the city blink beneath them, not as a CEO and a playwright, but as two people who had stepped into something unexpected and let it become everything. And neither of them ever looked back. The rehearsal space was quieter than usual, the scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air after Poppy's final set adjustments. She stood at the center of the stage, barefoot on the wooden platform she'd built with her own hands, staring up at the newly installed lighting rig. The soft overhead glow cast a golden wash over the scene. A city stoop, a cracked sidewalk, and a single lamppost with a flickering bulb, her latest play's entire world. Luca leaned in the doorway, unnoticed for a moment, his hands in the pockets of his dark wool coat. He didn't speak. Watching her like this, focused, still, utterly in her element, was a kind of reverence he never expected to feel for anything outside his empire. You missed your last board meeting, she said without turning. I know, he replied, stepping into the room. It'll survive without me, she glanced over her shoulder, a slight arch of her brow. That's not something you would have said 2 months ago. I'm not who I was 2 months ago. She offered a small nod, then looked back at the stage. I got the call this morning. We've been granted a residency at the Ludlow Theater. They're giving us 3 months and full use of the space. Luca blinked. That's huge. It is, she said, quiet. And I wouldn't have applied if you hadn't shown up that night and reminded me that I could. He stepped closer, reaching for her hand. You would have found your way, you always do. No, she said, turning to face him. That's the thing, Luca. I'm used to doing everything alone. I didn't realize how much I wanted someone to stand in the wings with me. He tightened his grip on her fingers. I'm not going anywhere, she hesitated. Then there's something I need you to see. She crossed the room and lifted a folded piece of paper from her notebook. It was slightly creased, ink smudged in one corner. She handed it to him. He unfolded it slowly. It was a scene. Dialogue between two characters, one named Luca, the other unnamed. The lines were raw, honest. Beneath the page, a short note was scribbled in the margin. Not a love story. A beginning. This is the new ending, he asked. No, she said. That's the new start. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the determination etched into every line of her face. What would you say, he asked, if I told you I bought the building next door? She blinked. What? The warehouse beside this one, he clarified. It was going to be torn down and replaced with a parking structure. I signed the paperwork yesterday. She stared at him, speechless. I want you to have it, he continued, for your company, for your stories. I'll renovate it, soundproof it, build you a stage that doesn't creak when you walk, and I'll put your name on the door. Her voice came out in a whisper. Why? Because you've given me something I never thought I'd have a reason to stop chasing everything that doesn't matter. I want to build things that last, starting with you. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. I never wanted to be someone's project. You're not, he said. You're the foundation. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached up and pulled him down into a kiss that was quiet and certain, like an answer to a question that had been asked long ago. Later, the two of them sat on the stoop of the set in the middle of the empty room, legs side by side, her head against his shoulder. The fake cityscape rose around them, but the world they were building felt more real than anything either of them had touched before. I told myself I'd never fall in love with someone who lived in skyscrapers, she said softly. He smiled into her hair. And I told myself I'd never find peace in a room full of chaos and paint fumes. We're both liars. No, he said. We just hadn't met the right contradiction yet. They didn't need promises after that. No grand declarations, just quiet certainty. 1 week later, the first curtain rose on her play at the Ludlow Theatre. The audience laughed, cried, and stood to applaud as the final scene faded into darkness. Luca watched from the front row, his hand pressed against his chest where the note she'd written him rested in his pocket. When she stepped out for her bow, the house erupted. But her eyes found only him. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. After the show, they walked home together, his jacket around her shoulders as the night wind swept through the streets. At the apartment, he'd helped her find a loft with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows. He paused by the door, reaching into his coat. Before we go in, he said, drawing out a small box, her breath caught, you already gave me a bracelet. This isn't like that. He opened it. Inside sat a ring, simply set with a single emerald-cut diamond. I'm not asking for perfect, he said. I'm asking for the messy, beautiful, impossible life we've already started. Say yes, and I'll spend the rest of it making sure you never have to do anything alone again. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said, her voice steady. He slid the ring onto her finger and she kissed him right there, beneath the flickering hallway light. 3 months later, they were married in the rooftop garden of the Sterling Grand, surrounded by the people they loved and the city that had brought them together. She wore a dress stitched with lines from her favorite plays. He wore the cufflinks she'd found in a box labeled Someday. The ceremony was short. The vows were handwritten. The kiss was long. Afterward, they danced to no music at all, just the sound of wind between buildings and the occasional honk of a cab in the distance. They didn't need a honeymoon to feel like they'd escaped the world. They had each other, and everything ahead. She kept writing. He kept building, and together they created a life full of stories neither of them had ever dared to imagine, real, earned, unshakably theirs.